The corsage they gave me was wrong. I noticed it the moment the florist's assistant pinned it to my lapel, a spray of white dendrobium orchids, which were fine, but which I had not requested, because no one had thought to ask me what I wanted. I had been assigned a corsage the way you assign seating to a distant relative whose name you keep misspelling on the place card, with the efficient indifference of someone managing a problem rather than welcoming a person. I held my small beaded purse in both hands and said nothing. My hands are not elegant hands. They are the hands of a woman who spent 22 years in the freight and logistics business, who signed contracts in cold warehouses and drove flatbeds, and once changed a blown tire on a mountain highway in February because the driver was useless and the cargo couldn't wait. My knuckles are large and my palms are permanently calloused, and there are 2 fingers on my left hand that don't straighten fully anymore from an old loading dock injury I never had properly treated. I looked at them holding that small, useless purse, and I thought, at least I know what my hands have done. My son Daniel was across the room, standing with his groomsmen, looking the way men look when they are trying not to show that something is wrong. He was 34 years old, and he was marrying Petra Brooks, and he was the best thing I had ever done, and I was going to stand in the correct place and smile at the correct moments, because that was what you did when your child chose someone, and you were not certain of the choice. The Brooks had made clear, in the 10 months since the engagement, that they were not certain of me. It had started with small things. Reginald Brooks, Petra's father, a commercial real estate developer with a firm handshake and a credit rating I happened to know was considerably less impressive than his suit suggested, had asked me at the engagement dinner what I did. I told him I was retired. He had smiled in the particular way of a man who has decided the conversation is over. His wife, Lorraine, had looked at my blouse, cotton, ironed, bought at a department store 3 years prior, and redirected her attention to something more interesting behind my shoulder. Petra herself had been gracious enough in those early months, but there was a quality to her graciousness that reminded me of customer service, performed, skilled, and entirely conditional. I drove a 2009 Honda Accord. I lived in a 3-bedroom house in a suburb that had been working class when I bought it in 1987 and was now merely unfashionable. I shopped at the grocery store with a canvas tote bag. I did these things not because I was performing humility, but because I had never needed to perform anything. The money was real. It had always been real. I simply did not require it to feel like myself. The ceremony was held in a venue that cost, I estimated, somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000. Tall windows, arrangements of white peonies, 500 guests, of whom I recognized perhaps 11. Daniel had looked for me when he took his place at the altar, and when he found me in the 3rd row, I had been moved from the 2nd, which was a thing that had happened with a brief apology and no explanation. His face had done something complicated. I smiled at him. He steadied. The trouble began at the reception. We were 40 minutes into the cocktail hour when Reginald Brooks tapped a champagne glass and asked for the room's attention. He was good at rooms. I will give him that. He had the physical confidence of a man who has never had a door close in his face, and he wore it the way he wore his cufflinks, as though it were simply the natural condition of things. He spoke warmly about Petra, about Daniel, about the life they would build. He made a joke about the venue that landed well. And then he paused, and the pause had a shape to it, and I recognized the shape, and I set my water glass down. Now, he said, I have to be honest with you all. We are a family that values certain things, background, accomplishment, knowing who you are and where you come from. He smiled at the room. And when Daniel came to us and told us about his family, well, we were hopeful. He looked at me. He had the grace to make it seem almost incidental, almost accidental, almost as though he had not arranged the entire preceding 30 seconds for exactly this purpose. Catherine, he said, Daniel's mother, she's with us today. He gestured toward me in a way that made the gesture feel like a presentation. Now I understand she worked very hard. In shipping, was it? Something like that. A small, well-timed pause. We have enormous respect for working people, enormous respect. He let that sit. But Daniel, I have to tell you, as your new father-in-law, as someone who has built something in this world, you have outgrown your circumstances. And that is something to celebrate. The room was not entirely comfortable. I could see it, the slight shifts, the glances, the 2 or 3 people who understood immediately what was happening and were deciding how much they wanted to witness. 500 people, most of them Brooks or Brooks adjacent, recalibrating. Lorraine laughed lightly from her seat beside him. "What Reginald means," she said, in the voice of a woman smoothing something that did not require smoothing, "is that, Catherine, darling, you must be so proud that Daniel has found his way into a family that can really provide." Provide. She had chosen the word carefully, the way you choose a knife. "I'm sure she did her best," Reginald said, with the generous finality of a verdict. "But let's be honest, she's not exactly what anyone would call a contribution." He found a better word then, the one he'd been building toward, and he delivered it cleanly. It's remarkable, really, how little of where he came from shows. It was the word little that did it for most of the room. I watched several faces change. A woman 2 tables over put her glass down. A man near the back stopped mid-gesture. These were people with manners, not necessarily kindness, but manners, and what Reginald had just done fell below the floor of even their tolerance. Petra was seated at the head table. She was looking at her father the way a student looks at a teacher who has just confirmed exactly what she believed. And then she looked at me and she laughed. It was a small laugh, quickly covered, replaced immediately by a neutral expression, but it was real. It had come out before the performance could catch it. Daniel heard it. I watched him hear it. I watched the thing that happened in his face when that sound reached him, a kind of stillness, then a kind of opening, like a door that has been held shut for a long time finally giving way on its hinges. He was sitting at the head table. He was in his wedding suit. He had a champagne flute in his hand that he set down with a care that suggested he was managing something very large through a very small action. He stood up. "No," he said. The room was already quiet. It became a different kind of quiet. "No," he said again, to no one in particular, and then to Petra. "I need you to tell me that wasn't funny to you." Petra's expression shifted through several configurations quickly. "Daniel," it was just, "tell me it wasn't funny." She said nothing, which was, of course, its own answer. He looked at me. I had not moved. My hands were in my lap, the beaded purse gone somewhere, my corsage still pinned slightly crooked on my lapel. I looked at my son and I kept my face exactly as it was. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry." He took off his boutonniere, a single ivory rose, and set it on the table. Then he walked toward me, through the silence of 500 people who had stopped being guests and become witnesses, and he held out his hand, and I took it, and we walked out. My car was in the lot. The 2009 Accord, dark blue, with a crack in the dashboard that I had never gotten around to fixing. Daniel sat in the passenger seat and stared at the floor mat for a long time without speaking. "That's going to cost me my position at Bellamy," he said, finally. He was a structural engineer. Bellamy and Cross was the firm he'd been with for 6 years. Reginald Brooks had, over the past year, quietly become one of their larger clients. "Yes," I said, "probably." He looked at me. "You're not going to tell me it'll be fine." "It'll be manageable," I said. "That's different." He was quiet again. Then, "Mom, who are you?" I had been waiting for this question for 34 years, in the way you wait for something you know is coming, and have no idea how to answer when it arrives. I drove us to the storage facility on Watts Road, which I had been renting for 19 years under a corporate name that bore no obvious connection to me. Inside Unit 14B, behind a climate-controlled door with a biometric lock, was a desk, a filing system, a laptop, and a phone that I checked every morning and which had, in the preceding 6 hours, received 11 messages I had not yet read. The room smelled of paper and metal, and the particular neutral cold of a place that exists for work and nothing else. I sat at the desk. I opened the laptop. I turned it so Daniel could see the screen. He read for a long time. "The logistics company," he said. "The logistics company and the 2 subsidiaries, and the real estate portfolio, which is mostly industrial." I paused. "And some other things." "Other things?" 11 other things, I said. It's been a long time. He sat down on the single folding chair in the corner. He was still in his wedding suit. He put his face in his hands for a moment, and then he took it out and looked at me with the expression of a person reorganizing every memory they have ever had. Why didn't you? Tell you, I thought about it. You never needed it to be who you are, and I needed to know you'd become yourself without it. He looked at the room, at the filing cabinet, the phone, the desk with its stacks of organized folders, at my hands on the keyboard. Okay, he said. Okay, I said. Now let's talk about Bellamy. I made 2 calls that week. The first was to a debt acquisition firm I had worked with before, a quiet, institutional arrangement, not the kind of company that advertises. Reginald Brooks, as I had known for some time through channels I had never felt the need to discuss, had leveraged 3 of his commercial properties against a development project in the warehouse district that had been quietly failing for 2 years. The debt on those properties had been bundled and sold twice. I purchased the senior position in that debt at a price that reflected its true risk, which the seller was relieved to accept. I did not call Reginald to tell him. The second call was to a former colleague, a woman I had done business with for 15 years, who now sat on the board of a regional bank that held the Brooks family's primary operating line of credit. I did not ask her to do anything. I asked her to coffee. We talked for an hour about things unrelated to the Brooks. When I left, I knew what I needed to know about the loan covenant review that was scheduled for the following quarter. Daniel, in the meantime, had been released from Bellamy and Cross within 10 days. Not fired, technically, but the contract had not been renewed, which was the polite mechanism for the same outcome. He was, genuinely, one of the better structural engineers in the region, and I knew 3 firms who would have said so unprompted. By the end of the month, he was in conversation with 2 of them. I made no calls on his behalf. He did not know I could have. He was doing it himself. That was the point. The Brooks came to my house in April. It was a Saturday morning, early enough that the neighbor's dog was still sleeping, and I was in the kitchen with my coffee and the newspaper, an actual newspaper, ink on paper, the Saturday edition, when I heard the car in the driveway. I looked out the window. A black SUV, recent model, Reginald behind the wheel, Lorraine in the passenger seat. No Petra. I opened the door before they knocked. Reginald had prepared something. I could see the preparation, the set of the shoulders, the controlled breath, the opening line he had arranged and was about to deliver. My house, which was modest and clean and smelled of coffee and wood soap, seemed to destabilize him slightly. He had expected different territory and was recalculating. "Catherine," he said, "we need to talk about the Watts Road holdings." So he had found that much, not surprising. "Come in," I said. They sat in my living room, on the sofa I had owned for 15 years. Lorraine looked at the room in the way she had looked at my blouse at the engagement dinner. Reginald looked at me. "We're aware of the debt position you've acquired," he said. "And I want to be very clear, what you're doing is predatory and it's personal, and I have lawyers who—" "Your lawyers have my lawyer's contact information," I said. "Catherine, you're in default on the Watts Road covenant as of March the 14th, I said. "That's not my assessment. That's the bank's. I had nothing to do with the audit that found it." I poured coffee without asking if they wanted any. "What I have is a legal interest in a distressed debt position that you created before you ever met me." He looked at his wife, then back at me. "You're doing this because of the wedding," he said. I looked at him. I thought about the corsage crooked on my lapel, about the word contribution, about Petra's laugh which had come out before she could stop it. "I'm doing this because it's sound," I said. "Whether it's also satisfying is a private matter." He tried 3 more approaches over the next 40 minutes. Lorraine tried twice, in a register that moved from imperious to plaintive and then, briefly, to something that might have been genuine. I listened to all of it. I refilled my own coffee once. I did not raise my voice. There was nothing to be angry about. Everything was already in motion. When they left, the dog next door had woken up and was barking at something in the hedge. The hearing was in June. It was not a criminal matter. I want to be precise about that. It was a regulatory filing review conducted by the State Commerce Division regarding representations made in the Brooks Development Project's initial funding documents. Representations that, it emerged, had been optimistic in ways that crossed a line. I was not present. I had no reason to be present. The documentation spoke for itself, and it had been speaking to the relevant parties for 2 months through the careful intermediation of people whose job it was to let it speak. The local business press covered it. Not extensively, it was a mid-size firm, a mid-size filing, the kind of story that gets 4 paragraphs on the business page and a longer follow-up 6 weeks later. But enough. Reginald's name was in the paragraphs. The nature of the misrepresentations was in the paragraphs. The current status of the Watts Road properties was briefly noted. I read it over breakfast. I folded the newspaper and put it in the recycling bin. I thought about Petra. I did, genuinely. She was 29 years old and had been raised by people who taught her that the world was arranged by status, and that status was the point, and she had simply learned her lessons. What she did with the rest of her life was her own business and none of mine. Daniel called me that evening. He had taken a position with a smaller firm, not a step down exactly, but different. A partnership track rather than a salaried role. More risk, more ownership. He had called me twice in the preceding months to talk through the business structure, and both times I had listened and asked questions and not told him what to do, and both times he had arrived at the right answer on his own. "How are you?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "Busy." "Mom," a pause. "I'm glad you're my mother." I was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the backyard was going dim in the early summer evening, the oak tree at the far end holding its shape against the last of the light. "I know," I said. "I'm glad too." After we hung up, I sat for a while at the kitchen table. The coffee cup was empty. The newspaper was in the recycling. The beaded purse from the wedding was still on the hall table where I had put it 5 months ago and not yet moved, a small useless thing from a day I was not ready to entirely put away. My hands were flat on the table. The calloused palms, the crooked fingers, the knuckles that had earned every year of what they looked like. Outside, the oak tree was very still. I got up and washed my cup and went to bed.